Daniel Hayes pulled his wife's name card off the head table, dropped it into a waiter's hand like it was trash, and told him to move it near the kitchen. Then he set a new card in Victoria's chair. It read, Mrs. Daniel Hayes. The woman it belonged to was not Victoria. It was his assistant, Madison, and around Madison's neck hung the pearl necklace that had belonged to Victoria's grandmother. Daniel looked up, saw his wife frozen in the doorway, and smiled as if he had done nothing at all. If a moment like that has ever happened to you, if someone ever tried to make you small so they could look big, then please subscribe to this channel and stay with Victoria's story until the very end. And leave a comment telling me what city you are watching from, because I truly want to see how far this story travels tonight. Victoria stood in the doorway of the ballroom and could not make her feet move. She had walked into that hotel 100 times. She knew the way the marble floor sounded under her shoes, knew the coat check girl by name, knew which elevator ran slow. She had helped plan events in that very room. She knew everything about it. And yet in that one moment, she did not recognize a single thing, because the one thing she had always counted on being there, her seat beside her husband, was gone. She told herself she was seeing it wrong. She told herself the lights were playing tricks, that maybe the tables had been rearranged, that maybe Daniel had a surprise for her, and this was part of it. She told herself a dozen soft, hopeful lies in the space of about 4 seconds. And then Madison turned her head, caught Victoria's eye, and touched the pearls at her throat with 2 fingers, slow and deliberate. And every soft lie in Victoria's mind went silent at once. "That's my grandmother's necklace," Victoria whispered, though no one was close enough to hear her. A waiter appeared at her elbow. He was young, maybe 22, and he could not meet her eyes. "Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly, "your seat has been moved, if you'll follow me." "Moved where?" "There's a table near the back. Mr. Hayes arranged it." Victoria looked past the boy at her husband. Daniel was leaning toward an investor, laughing at something, his hand resting easy on Madison's chair. He had not looked at Victoria again. He had made his point when he smiled at her, and now he was done with her, the way a man is done with a light switch after he has flipped it. "Take me to my husband," Victoria said. "Ma'am, I really think—" "Take me to my husband, please." She said please, and the boy flinched, because there is a kind of please that is more frightening than any shout, and she had used it. He led her to the head table anyway, because he did not know what else to do. Daniel saw her coming, and his face rearranged itself into something patient and reasonable, the face he used for people he considered difficult. "Vic," he said warmly, standing halfway up, "you made it. Good. My seat. Keep your voice down. My seat, Daniel. Where is my seat?" He put a hand on her arm and turned her slightly so that his back was to the table, and the investors could not see his face. His voice dropped to something low and private and cold. "Tonight is the biggest night of my career," he said. "There are 400 people in this room, and half of them are holding checkbooks. I need this to go perfectly. I need calm. I need the room to feel a certain way. And I made a decision about the seating that works better for the optics. That's all it is. Optics. Optics. Madison handles the client relationships. It makes sense for her to sit up here for the presentation. It's a business call. Don't make it into something it isn't." Victoria looked at Madison, who was watching them both with the careful stillness of a cat that has heard a door open. Then she looked back at her husband. "She's wearing my grandmother's pearls, Daniel." For 1 second, something crossed his face. Not guilt. Calculation. He was deciding how much to admit. "I don't know anything about the necklace," he said. "Maybe she has a similar one. Now please, sit down at your table, enjoy the evening, and let me do my job. We'll talk at home." Victoria had been married to this man for 11 years. She had learned over those years 1,000 small ways to keep the peace. She had learned when to speak and when to swallow it, when to press and when to let go. She had built an entire quiet architecture inside herself out of letting things go. And in that moment, standing there with his hand steering her away from her own chair, she felt that architecture crack straight down the middle. But she did not scream. She did not make a scene. Not because she was afraid, though part of her was. She stayed quiet because something in her had gone very still and very clear, the way the air goes still before the worst kind of storm. And in that stillness, a single thought arrived and would not leave. He doesn't want a wife beside him. He wants someone behind him. She let the waiter lead her to the small table near the kitchen doors. She sat down. She placed her clutch on the white cloth, folded her hands, and looked at the water glass in front of her, and she let herself understand fully, and finally, the shape of what her marriage had actually been. Because this was not the first time. That was the thing that landed on her like a slow weight. This was only the first time she was seeing it clearly. There had been 100 smaller versions of this night spread across 11 years, and she had explained every single one of them away. The time her design won the firm, the Riverside contract, and Daniel accepted the award and said, "My team worked incredibly hard," and never once said her name, and later when she mentioned it, he told her she was being petty, that a marriage was a partnership, and there was no his and hers. The time an investor complimented her at a dinner, said the community integration plan was the smartest thing he'd seen in a decade, and Daniel laughed and said, "I'll pass that along to my people," and steered the conversation to golf. The time she asked why her name wasn't on the incorporation documents, and he told her it was a tax thing, and kissed her forehead, and she believed him because believing him was easier than the alternative. She had believed him because the alternative was sitting alone at a table by the kitchen doors on the biggest night of the year, watching another woman wear her grandmother's pearls. And now here she was, and there was nothing left to believe. A waiter set a bread plate in front of her. She thanked him. She noticed distantly, still being polite. Some habits are carved deep. At the head table, Daniel had already forgotten she existed. He was in his element now, leaning into the light, the charming public version of himself that everyone loved. Victoria had built that version. She knew it the way a sculptor knows a statue. The confidence, the easy stories, the way he made every investor feel like the most important person in the room. All of it had been coached, softened, rehearsed over years of her patient work behind the scenes. She had made him, and he had just moved her to the back of the room so his mistress could wear her seat and her name. Mrs. Daniel Hayes. That was what the card said. As if Victoria were the imposter. As if there were an opening for the role and Madison had simply been promoted. Victoria picked up her water glass and found that her hand was steady. She had expected it to shake. It did not. That steadiness frightened her more than any tremor would have, because it told her that something inside her had already decided something, some deep, quiet part of her that had made up its mind before the rest of her caught up. She did not yet know what it had decided. She only knew it was final. Across the room, a woman she vaguely knew. The wife of one of the investors caught her eye from another table and gave her a small, confused wave, then glanced toward the head table, then back at Victoria, and her face did a complicated thing. Pity. That was what it was. The woman had put it together, and now she felt sorry for Victoria, and she was trying to hide it and failing. That was almost the worst part. Not Daniel's cruelty. The pity of strangers who understood the arrangement before Victoria's own husband would say it out loud. The lights dimmed slightly, and a man's voice came over the sound system, welcoming everyone to the Lakefront Legacy Gala. There was applause. Somewhere a string quartet started up. Waiters moved between the tables with wine. The whole enormous machine of the evening rolled forward, indifferent to the fact that a marriage had just ended at a small table near the kitchen, quietly without a single raised voice. Victoria did not cry. She had cried plenty in 11 years, always privately, always in a way that did not inconvenience anyone. She was done with that too. Instead, she did something she had not done in a very long time. She began coldly and carefully to think about herself. Not about how to keep Daniel calm. Not about how to make the night go smoothly for him. About herself. About what she wanted. About what she was owed. The list was longer than she had let herself admit. She thought about the waterfront project. The one Daniel would present tonight, the crown jewel, the deal that would make him untouchable. She thought about the folder on her home computer, the one labeled with her own initials, the folder full of the original renderings, the environmental restoration studies, the community housing framework, all of it dated, all of it hers, all of it created in the long nights while Daniel slept. She thought about a sentence she had not thought about in 2 years, spoken to her at a conference by a man she barely knew, a man everyone in that ballroom feared. "It is strange," he had said, holding her proposal, "that your name is missing from something this brilliant." She had laughed it off at the time. She had said something modest and moved on, but the sentence had stayed lodged in her like a splinter you forget about until you press the right spot. And now, sitting alone at the back of the room, she pressed the spot and it lit up. Her name was missing. It had been missing for years. She had let it be missing. She had handed her name away piece by piece in exchange for peace, and she had ended up with neither. A hand set a plate of food in front of her. She did not look at it. She was so far inside her own thoughts that she did not notice the change in the room at first. It came slowly, a ripple, a shift in the volume of conversation, the way a crowd quiets when someone important enters. Heads turned toward the main doors. The string quartet kept playing, but people had stopped listening to it. Something more interesting had walked in. Victoria lifted her eyes. Ethan Walker had entered the ballroom. She knew him by sight, the way everyone in Chicago real estate knew him by sight. He was the CEO of Walker Global Development, and he was the one man Daniel had never been able to charm, outbid, or outmaneuver. Daniel spoke his name only in private, and only with a tightness in his jaw. Walker Global had beaten Hayes on 3 major contracts in the last 5 years, and Daniel had never gotten over any of them. Ethan Walker did not look for Daniel. He did not look for the head table at all. He stood just inside the doors for a moment, scanning the room, and there was something almost searching in it, as though he had come there for one specific reason and was locating it. Victoria watched him the way everyone else did, with curiosity, expecting him to make his way toward the power at the front of the room, expecting the 2 rivals to shake hands in front of the cameras. Instead, Ethan Walker turned his head and his eyes found her. Not the head table, her. Alone at the small table by the kitchen. For one strange, suspended second, they simply looked at each other across the entire length of the ballroom, and Victoria felt something she had not felt in years and could not immediately name. Then she named it, and it startled her. She felt seen. He began to walk toward her, not quickly, not making a show of it, but directly cutting a clean diagonal line across the ballroom, past the important tables, past the outstretched hands of people who wanted his attention, past a senator who actually rose halfway out of his chair to greet him and was left standing. Ethan Walker walked past all of it, and every eye in the room turned to follow him, trying to understand where he was going, and one by one they arrived at the answer, which was the woman at the small table near the kitchen doors, and the confusion in the room became something you could almost hear at the head table. Daniel stopped talking. Victoria saw it happen. She saw her husband's easy smile freeze, saw him track Ethan's path across the room, and understand where it was leading a half second before everyone else did. She saw the exact moment the calculation started behind his eyes, the moment he tried to figure out what this was and how to control it. Ethan Walker stopped in front of Victoria's table. Up close, he was taller than she expected, and quieter. There was nothing performative about him. He simply stood there and looked at her with an expression of grave, focused attention, as though the 400 people watching them did not exist. "Victoria Hayes," he said. It was not a question. "Mr. Walker." "Ethan." "Ethan," she repeated. He glanced once briefly at the small table at the kitchen doors behind her, at the distance between where she sat and where her name card should have been. Then he looked back at her, and something moved through his face that she recognized because she had felt it herself only minutes earlier. It was quiet anger, controlled and cold, and entirely on her behalf. "They put you back here," he said. "Apparently." "May I ask why?" Victoria almost gave the polite answer. The habit was that strong. She almost said something about optics and business decisions and her husband's big night. But she looked at this man who had crossed an entire ballroom to reach her, and she found she did not want to lie to him. "My seat was reassigned," she said, "to someone who fit the evening better." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a shame, because I came here tonight for exactly one reason, and it was to talk to the person who actually designed the Harbor Line concept, and I'm told she's the only one in this room worth talking to." Victoria's breath caught. He had said the Harbor Line concept. That was her name for it. Her private name from her private files, not the name Daniel used publicly. Her name. Before she could speak, another voice arrived, smooth and loud and false. "Ethan, good to see you." Daniel had crossed the room after all. He arrived at the table with his hand already extended, his public smile fixed in place, his eyes doing something frantic underneath it. "Glad you could make it," Daniel said. "Big night for us. Big announcement coming. Let me introduce you around, get you a proper seat up front." Ethan looked at Daniel's extended hand. He did not take it. The room noticed. The room noticed everything now. "Daniel," Ethan said pleasantly, "I was just speaking with your wife." "Yes, well," Daniel's laugh had a crack in it. "Vic's not really one for business talk at these things. She likes to keep it social. Isn't that right, Vic? Why don't I get you two settled and we can—" "I asked her a question." Ethan said, still pleasant, still calm, and I'd like to hear her answer it, if that's all right with her. He turned back to Victoria and left Daniel standing there with his hand out and his smile dying. And this was the moment. Victoria understood it was the moment, even as it was happening. For 11 years, every choice at every event like this had been made for her. Where she sat when she spoke what she said, how much of herself she was allowed to bring into the room. Daniel had decided all of it. And now, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a person was standing in front of her and asking her what she wanted. "Victoria," Ethan said, "would you dance with me?" The ballroom went completely silent. Even the string quartet seemed to hesitate. 400 people held 400 breaths. Daniel's investors were watching. The senator was watching. The woman who had pitied her was watching. Madison up at the head table had risen halfway from her chair, one hand still at the pearls, her face white. And Daniel stood frozen beside the little table, his hand finally lowered, his mouth slightly open, all his careful control evaporating in front of the people he most needed to impress. "She's not interested," Daniel said quickly. "She doesn't dance at these things. Victoria, tell him." But Ethan was not looking at Daniel. He was looking at Victoria, and his hand was extended, and his eyes were steady, and he was waiting. He was actually waiting to hear what she wanted. He had asked, and now he was leaving the answer to her. Victoria looked at her husband's hand, lowered now and empty. She looked at Madison and the pearls. She looked at the small table and the kitchen doors and the whole quiet machinery of the night that had decided without asking her that she did not matter. And then she looked at the hand extended toward her, and she made her own decision. "Yes," she said, "I'd love to." She stood. She took Ethan Walker's hand, and she walked with him past her stunned husband, past the pale Mistress, past the head table with its 2 name cards into the center of the ballroom under the lights in front of everyone. The murmur that went through the crowd was like a wave breaking. Ethan turned to face her and placed one hand lightly at her back, and the quartet, after a beat of confusion, found its way into a slow, steady peace, and they began to move. And for the first time in years, Victoria was standing in the center of a room instead of at the edge of one. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "Do what? Cross the entire room, in front of everyone. You've just made an enemy of the most connected man in Chicago real estate." Ethan almost smiled. "Daniel Hayes was already my enemy. That's not new. What's new is that I finally get to tell you something I've been meaning to tell you for 2 years. "And what's that?" "That the Harborline concept was the best environmental restoration plan I've seen in my career. That I read it 3 times. That I knew the first time I read it that Daniel Hayes did not write it, because I've read enough of what Daniel Hayes writes to know he isn't capable of it." He paused. "And that I have spent 2 years wondering why the person who did write it let a man like that put his name on it." Victoria's throat tightened. She kept her chin up. She had promised herself she would not cry, and she meant to keep that promise. "I let him," she said, "because I thought that was what marriage was, standing behind someone, making them look good, disappearing when they needed the light. And now—" She looked over his shoulder across the ballroom to where Daniel stood watching them with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It took her a moment to identify it, because in 11 years she had never once seen him wear it. Fear. I was afraid, not of losing her. She understood that with a clarity that felt almost surgical. He was not afraid of losing his wife. He was afraid of losing control of her. He had spent 11 years making sure she stayed small and quiet and grateful, because a woman who knew her own worth was dangerous to a man built entirely out of borrowed brilliance. And now that woman was in the middle of the room, dancing with his greatest rival, and he could feel the whole careful structure of his life beginning to tilt. "And now," Victoria said slowly, turning back to Ethan, "I think I'm finished disappearing." They danced. The music played. The room watched. And somewhere in the middle of that song, without either of them saying anything more, an understanding passed between them that would take months to fully unfold, but that was already in that moment completely clear. When the song ended, Ethan stepped back and gave her a small, formal nod, the kind of nod one professional gives another, and it meant more to her than any embrace could have. "There's something you should know," he said low, before he makes his announcement tonight. "The project he's about to present as his own. I've seen the submission that went to the investors, and I've seen your Harborline files because you presented an early version at the Midwest Development Conference 2 years ago, and I never forgot it." He held her eyes. "They're the same project, Victoria. He didn't adapt your work. He didn't build on it. He submitted it. Your restoration plan, your community framework, your renderings. He took your name off the cover page and put his on, and tonight he's going to stand up in front of 400 people and call it his life's work. Victoria stood very still in the center of the ballroom. She had suspected. Somewhere underneath she had always suspected. But suspecting a thing and hearing it said out loud by a witness who had seen the proof are two different experiences, and the second one changes you. He replaced my seat, she said quietly, almost to herself, and he replaced my name. Yes, he replaced me. He tried, Ethan said. But here's the thing about a project like Harbor Line. It has an author, and an author leaves fingerprints, dates, files, drafts, records. The truth of who made a thing doesn't disappear just because someone scratches the name off the cover. He paused. If you wanted to prove it was yours, you could. I imagine you kept everything. People who do the real work usually do. Victoria thought of the folder on her home computer, the one with her initials, the one full of dated files going back years. I kept everything, she said. Something in Ethan's face settled as though she had confirmed something he had already believed about her. Then you're not the person at the small table by the kitchen, he said. You never were. You're the person who built the thing they're all here to celebrate. And I think before this is over, this entire room is going to know it. He stepped back. He gave her that formal nod again. Thank you for the dance, Victoria. I hope it isn't the last time you decide something for yourself tonight. And he walked away, cutting the same clean line back across the room, past the same reaching hands, and this time he did stop at the main doors, and this time he did turn back once to look at her, and then he was gone. Victoria stood alone in the center of the ballroom under the lights. Daniel came toward her fast, his face working his voice a furious whisper the second he was close enough. What was that? What in God's name was that? Do you have any idea what you just did? Every investor in this room just watched my wife dance with Ethan Walker like some kind of... He stopped himself. He was shaking. You embarrassed me. You humiliated me on the most important night of my life. And for what? To get back at me over a seating chart. Victoria looked at him. She looked at the man she had spent 11 years making look good, the man she had covered for, and softened and built the man who had just moved her name aside so his mistress could wear it, and she felt for the first time in years absolutely nothing that resembled fear. You're about to go up on that stage, she said calmly, and present Harbor Line as your project. Daniel blinked. The change of subject threw him. What are you talking about? The environmental restoration plan, the community housing framework, the renderings you're about to put up on that screen. You're going to call them yours. They are mine. They're the firm's. They're mine, Daniel. She said it quietly. She said it without heat. And that was what made him go still, because he had spent 11 years listening to her raise her voice in frustration and knew exactly how to wait out her anger. But this was not anger. This was something he had never heard from her before. This was certainty. I designed Harbor Line, she said, every part of it. 2 years ago, before you ever brought it to an investor, I built it at our kitchen table at night while you slept. And I have the files, dated, labeled, backed up in 3 places because I am careful, because I have always had to be careful, because I have spent my whole marriage cleaning up after a man who thinks a signature is the same thing as work. She tilted her head. You took my name off the cover. And tonight you're going to stand up in front of 400 people, and you're going to call my work your life's achievement, and you're going to do it because for 11 years I let you believe that I would sit quietly at the back of the room and let you. Daniel's face had gone very pale. But I'm not at the back of the room anymore, Daniel, Victoria said. You moved me, and in moving me you finally made me understand something I should have understood a long time ago. She stepped closer to him and lowered her voice, and it was the same terrible, gentle pleas from the beginning of the night. The biggest betrayal in this room tonight was never the woman sitting in my chair. It was the man who spent 11 years convincing me my place was behind him. She turned to walk away. Daniel caught her arm. You wouldn't, he said. Whatever you think you have, whatever you think you're going to do, you wouldn't. You'd be destroying the firm. You'd be destroying us. Everything we built. Victoria looked down at his hand on her arm and then up at his face. We didn't build it, Daniel, she said. I built it. You just accepted the awards. She removed his hand from her arm, finger by finger, the way you remove something that has no right to be touching you. And then she walked out of the ballroom past the small table with its untouched plate, past the kitchen doors into the marble hallway where she knew the way the floor sounded under her shoes. Behind her, the lights came up on the stage and a voice announced that Daniel Hayes would now present the future of Chicago's lakefront. There was applause, but it sounded thin to Victoria as the doors swung shut behind her, and it sounded thinner still to Daniel standing at the edge of the stage with his notes shaking in his hand because he had just watched something walk out of the room that he had always believed he owned, and he was beginning far too late to understand that he had never owned it at all. Victoria drove home alone that night. She did not cry in the car. She had promised herself, and she kept it. She sat at every red light with her hands steady on the wheel and let the certainty settle deeper into her, the certainty that had arrived at the small table by the kitchen and had not left her since. When she got home, she did not go to bed. She went to her office and she turned on her computer and she opened the folder with her initials. And there it all was, 2 years of work, every file, every date, every draft, every version of Harbor Line from the first rough sketch to the final polished proposal, all of it created before Daniel had ever spoken the project's name to a single investor. All of it proof. She sat and she looked at it for a long time. Then she opened her contacts and she found the number of the one person she had been putting off calling for months, ever since a small, cold feeling had started growing in her that she had refused to name. Rachel Morgan, attorney. Someone had recommended her at a fundraiser, and Victoria had taken the card and never used it, because using it would have meant admitting something she was not ready to admit. She was ready now. She wrote a short message. She said that her name was Victoria Hayes, that she had a great deal of documentation regarding intellectual property and the ownership of a major development project, and that she needed to meet as soon as possible, and that it was urgent, and that she was not in a hurry to explain any of it over text, but would explain all of it in person. She read it over twice. Her hand, she noticed, was still perfectly steady. She pressed send. And in the quiet of her office in the middle of the night, in a house that had never really felt like hers, Victoria Hayes felt something she had not felt in 11 years of marriage. She felt like the main character of her own life, not the supporting role, not the person behind the person, not the wife at the small table near the kitchen who was supposed to disappear whenever her husband's success required it. She felt for the first time like the author of the thing, the one whose fingerprints were on every page, the one whose name they had scratched off the cover but could never actually erase because the work itself remembered who made it. Somewhere across the city at that same hour, Daniel Hayes was sitting in a hotel bar with a drink he wasn't drinking, replaying the moment his wife had walked out of the room trying to convince himself it didn't mean what he knew it meant. And somewhere else, Madison Blake was taking off a necklace that had never belonged to her, and beginning to understand in a slow and unpleasant way that a man who would move his wife to the back of a room to make space for you is a man who will one day move you too. And somewhere else, Ethan Walker was looking out a high window at the lights on the lake, thinking about a woman who had crossed a ballroom with her chin up after a room full of people had watched her be humiliated, and thinking that he had been right about her for 2 years, and that he was rarely so glad to be right. But all of that was elsewhere. In her office alone, Victoria closed the folder and set her hands flat on the desk and made herself a single quiet promise in the dark. Never again would she let anyone tell her where her place was. She had spent 11 years learning to be smaller. She had one night, one seat, one scratched-off name to thank for finally teaching her the truth she should have known all along. She had always belonged at the front of the room. Now she was going to take it. Rachel Morgan read the folder in silence for 40 minutes, and Victoria watched her do it, and by the time Rachel closed the laptop, her face had changed completely. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, "Victoria, I want to make sure I understand what I'm looking at. Because if I'm understanding it correctly, your husband didn't just borrow your work. He committed something a great deal more serious than a bruised marriage." "Tell me what you see," Victoria said. "I see a project that was authored in full by you 2 years ago. I see date stamps, metadata draft after draft, all of it in your name, all of it before your husband ever submitted a single document to a single investor." Rachel folded her hands. "And then I see the version that went to the investors. Same renderings, same restoration plan, same community framework, and on the cover page one name, his. So it's real. It's real and it's provable, and if you want it to be, it's the kind of thing that ends a man's career." Rachel leaned back. The question I have to ask you, and I need you to think hard before you answer, is whether that's what you want. Because there is no small version of this Victoria. Once we pull this thread, the whole thing comes apart. His firm, his reputation, possibly his freedom depending on what else is in those financials. There's no putting it back. Victoria did not have to think. She had done all her thinking the night before alone in her office, watching the folder glow in the dark. "I don't want to put it back," she said. "I want my name on my work. That's all I've ever wanted. The rest of it, whatever happens to him, that's his own doing." Rachel studied her for a moment, and then she nodded, and something in the nod told Victoria she had just passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. "All right," Rachel said. "Then let me tell you what I found while you were sitting there being polite in my waiting room." She opened a second folder, a physical one this time. "You came to me about intellectual property, but I did what I always do, which is pull the public filings while I waited. And Victoria, your husband, has been busy. Busier than you know." Victoria went still. "What do you mean?" "I mean that 11 days ago, Daniel Hayes retained a divorce attorney." Rachel let that land. "Not a good one, a vicious one, the kind you hire when you intend to leave someone with nothing." The room seemed to tilt very slightly, then right itself. Victoria had expected many things. She had not expected this. He was leaving her. He had been leaving her for 11 days quietly in the dark, while she still made his coffee and ironed his shirts for the gala. 11 days, she repeated. "There's more, and it's worse. He filed to have himself named sole managing member of the holding company that controls the firm. He's trying to lock you out of the ownership structure before the divorce is even public. And there's a line item buried in the paperwork that seeks access to what it calls, quote, marital investment assets, unquote." Rachel looked up. "Victoria does. Your family have money in this company. Family money, yours specifically." Victoria's mouth had gone dry. "My grandmother left me a trust. When we started the firm, I invested part of it. Daniel said it would show the banks we had skin in the game. He said it was temporary." "How much?" "A little over $2 million. Rachel closed her eyes for a second, the way a doctor does when a test comes back exactly as feared. "He's not trying to leave you, Victoria. He's trying to erase you. First your name off the project, then your seat at the gala, and now your share of the company and your grandmother's money all at once, before you even know it's happening." She opened her eyes. The gala wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a signal. He was telling his investors in front of everyone that you were finished, that the transition had already begun. He wanted them comfortable with your absence before you were even gone. Victoria sat with that, the full shape of it. The man she had married had not simply fallen out of love. He had made a plan, a careful and patient plan, to take everything she had built and everything she had inherited and leave her standing in the wreckage, explaining to people that she used to matter. And he had almost pulled it off. If Ethan Walker had not crossed a ballroom, if Victoria had sat quietly at the small table and gone home and made his coffee the next morning, if she had explained this one away like all the others. "He underestimated me," she said quietly. "He did more than that," Rachel said. "He assumed you'd never look. He assumed the woman who let him take her name off her own work would never think to protect herself. And that assumption, Victoria, is going to be the most expensive mistake of his life, because you didn't just keep the design files." Rachel tapped the physical folder. "You kept everything, didn't you? The financials, the transfers, all of it." "I kept everything," Victoria said. "I always keep everything. He used to laugh at me for it." Rachel almost smiled. "He's not laughing now." That afternoon, Victoria did something she had not done in 11 years of marriage. She stopped waiting to see what her husband would do, and she moved first. She went home. She went to the safe in the bedroom closet, the one Daniel thought only he had the combination to, and she took out the things that mattered. The trust documents, the original incorporation papers, the ones with a certain conveniently omitted signature. A flash drive she had quietly kept updated for 2 years, a habit she had started for reasons she could never fully explain to herself, except that some deep animal part of her had never entirely trusted the man she slept beside. She was closing the safe when she heard the garage door. Daniel was home early. He was never home early. She heard him come up the stairs faster than usual, and when he came through the bedroom door, his face was already tight, already braced, and she understood immediately that someone had told him, someone at the firm. He knew she had met with a lawyer. "You met with Rachel Morgan," he said. Not a question. "I did." "Do you have any idea what you're doing? Do you understand what you're about to blow up?" He crossed the room. "You want to destroy the firm, fine, but that firm is paying for this house, for your car, for the life you seem to enjoy so much. You pull this stunt, you're not hurting me, you're hurting both of us." Victoria looked at him, and she felt the old pull, the 11-year-old instinct to soften, to smooth, to find the words that would make him calm. She let the instinct rise, and then she let it go. "You retained a divorce attorney 11 days ago," she said. Daniel stopped. For one single second, his face showed her the truth before he could hide it. Then the mask came down and he said, it's not what you think. I was exploring options every marriage goes through. You filed to make yourself sole managing member of the holding company. You filed to access, and I believe the phrase was marital investment assets. You were coming from my grandmother's trust, Daniel, the $2 million. You were going to take my name off the work, take my seat at the table, take my inheritance, and leave me explaining to people that I used to be someone. She kept her voice level. You had a plan. You've had it for a while. The gala was the announcement. You just forgot to tell me I was the one being announced out. Daniel's jaw worked. You can't prove any of that. And there it was. Not a denial. Not I would never. You can't prove it. She almost laughed. 11 years, and in the end he had told her exactly who he was in 3 words. That's the thing about you, Daniel, she said softly. You've always confused what you can get away with for what's true. You think if there's no proof it didn't happen. You put your name on my work and thought that made it yours. You moved my card and thought that made her your wife. She picked up her bag, the one with the flash drive and the trust papers and the incorporation documents inside it. But I've spent 11 years watching you get away with things, and I learned something you never did. I learned to keep the receipts. She walked past him toward the door. He grabbed her arm the same way he had at the gala, and she stopped and looked down at his hand, and this time she did not remove it finger by finger. This time she simply looked at it until he took it off himself. Victoria. His voice had changed. The anger was gone. Something worse was underneath it. Fear again, that same fear from the ballroom. Whatever you have, whatever Morgan thinks she can do, we can talk about this. We can work something out. You don't want to do this to me. You're right, she said. I don't want to do anything to you. I never did. I only ever wanted my name on my own work and a seat at my own table. She opened the bedroom door. You're the one who decided that was too much to ask. She left him standing in the bedroom, and she carried her bag down the stairs and out to her car, and she drove to a hotel and checked in under her maiden name, Victoria Prescott, a name she had not used in 11 years, and which felt saying it to the desk clerk like putting on a coat she'd forgotten she owned and finding it still fit. Over the next 2 weeks, the pieces began to move, and they moved faster than Daniel could track. Rachel filed first. She filed to protect the trust, freezing Daniel's access to the marital investment assets before he could touch $1 of Victoria's grandmother's money. She filed a separate action asserting Victoria's authorship of the Harbor Line intellectual property with the dated files attached as exhibits. And she made sure quietly and legally that copies of everything reached the one place that would do Daniel the most damage, the firm's board of directors. Victoria had not expected the emails. They started 3 days after the filings. First, a design associate, a young woman named Priya, who had worked under Victoria for years. Priya's message was short and shaking. She wrote that she had always known, that everyone in the design department had always known who really did the work, that she had a folder of her own of early Harbor Line drafts that Victoria had shared with the team with Victoria's name on every one, and that if it would help, they were hers. Then a project manager, then a junior architect, then most damaging of all, a senior accountant named Frank, who had been with the firm since the beginning, and who wrote Victoria a message that made her sit down slowly. Frank wrote that he had something Rachel should see, that there were payments, that over the past 8 months, the firm had been paying a consulting company for services no one could identify, and that when he had once asked Daniel about it, he had been told to mind his own department. Frank had, being a careful man, kept a record anyway. The consulting company was called Blakewood Strategic, and Frank, who was good at his job, had traced its single bank account to its single beneficiary, Madison Blake. Victoria read that email twice. Then she forwarded it to Rachel with one line. This is the last thing he'll expect us to find. Rachel called her within the hour. Do you understand what this is? Tell me. Your husband has been funneling company money to his mistress through a fake consulting firm. That's not a bruised marriage anymore, Victoria. That's not even just stolen credit. That's embezzlement. That's fraud against his own investors. If this is what Frank says it is, Daniel isn't looking at a bad divorce. He's looking at the kind of trouble that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with the federal government. Rachel paused. Did you know about the payments? No, Victoria said. And it was true. She had known about the affair, or half known in the way you half know things you're not ready to face. But this was new. Daniel had been stealing from his own company to keep Madison in necklaces and expensive dresses. He had used the firm Victoria built as his personal account. There's something almost fitting about it, Rachel said. He built his whole life on taking things that belong to other people and calling them his. He just finally took from someone who keeps records as well as you do. But the twist Victoria did not see coming, the one that changed the shape of everything, came 4 days later, and it did not come from Frank or from Rachel or from any file. It came from Madison. Madison called her. Victoria did not know how she'd gotten the hotel number. When the front desk said there was a Ms. Blake asking to be connected, Victoria's first instinct was to refuse. Then she thought about it, and she thought about the pearls, and something in her wanted to hear what this woman could possibly have to say. Victoria. Madison's voice was not what she expected. It was small. It was frightened. Please don't hang up. I know I have no right to call you. I know what you must think of me, but I need to tell you something, and I don't have anyone else to tell it to. And you're the only person in this whole thing who I think might actually understand it. Understand what? Victoria said flatly. That he did it to me too. Victoria said nothing. The consulting money, Madison said. Blakewood Strategic. I know they found it. Daniel told me they found it, and he's blaming me for it, Victoria. He's telling everyone it was my idea, that I set it up, that I pressured him. A shaking breath. But it was his. All of it was his. He set up the company. He told me to sign the papers. He said it was a bonus structure, that it was legitimate that everyone did it. I was 26 and stupid, and I believed him because I thought... She stopped. I thought he loved me. I thought I was the future and you were the past. That's what he told me. That's exactly what he told me. Victoria closed her eyes. And then a woman I've never spoken to danced with Ethan Walker at a gala. Madison went on, her voice cracking, and everything started falling apart, and the second it did... Daniel looked at me like I was a stranger, like I was a problem. He's already talking about how to distance himself from me. He's going to feed me to the wolves, Victoria. He's going to make me the whole story so he can walk away clean. And I finally understand something I should have understood a year ago. What's that? Victoria said quietly, though she already knew. That he never chose me either. I wasn't his future. I was just the next thing he used to replace you. And when the time comes, he'll find something to replace me too. A long silence. He was never going to end up with either of us. We were just tools. You for the work and me for the... She couldn't finish it. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. About the necklace. About all of it. I gave it back. I left it at the firm in an envelope with your name on it. I couldn't wear it anymore. It felt like it was burning me. Victoria sat on the edge of the hotel bed with the phone against her ear, and she felt something she had absolutely not expected to feel toward the woman who had worn her grandmother's pearls and sat in her chair. She felt pity. Not forgiveness. Not friendship. But a strange, clear-eyed recognition. Because Madison had made herself smaller, for the same man had disappeared into the same story, had believed the same performance. The only difference was that Victoria had 11 years of records and a grandmother's stubbornness in her blood, and Madison had nothing but a returned necklace and the dawning knowledge that she had been used and would now be discarded. Madison, Victoria said, I'm not going to tell you it's all right because it isn't, but I'll tell you one thing because you told me the truth just now, and I don't think you had to. She took a breath. If Daniel is going to make you the whole story, then your only protection is the same thing that turned out to be mine. Records. Anything you have. Anything he told you to sign. Anything he said to you about Blakewood in writing. A text. An email. Anything. You give that to a lawyer, and you give it fast before he finishes building the version of events where you're the villain and he's the man who got taken advantage of. A pause. You'd tell me that after what I did, I'd tell you that because a man convinced two women they were nothing, so he could be everything, Victoria said, and I'm done letting him decide which of us gets destroyed. When she hung up, Victoria sat very still for a long moment. Then she called Rachel and told her that Madison Blake was about to become the most cooperative witness they could possibly ask for, and that she'd be reaching out to a lawyer of her own, and that when she did, they should not treat her as an enemy. "You're telling me," Rachel said slowly, "that the mistress is going to help you take him down." "I'm telling you," Victoria said, "that Daniel spent his whole life making people smaller so he could feel bigger. And it turns out that when you do that to enough people one day, they all figure it out at the same time, and there's a lot more of them than there is of you." Rachel was quiet for a second. Then she said, "You know, when you first walked into my office, I thought I was representing a woman who'd been wronged. I'm starting to think I'm representing a woman who's about to change how a lot of people in this city think about who actually built half of what they admire." Victoria did not answer that, but she held it close after she hung up because it was in a way the only thing she had ever wanted anyone to say. The nights were still hard. That was the part no one saw. During the day she was strong, she was strategic, she was the woman keeping the receipts. But at night alone in the hotel 11 years came for her. The good moments, the real ones, or the ones she'd thought were real. The early days when they'd had nothing and had built the firm on a card table in a rented apartment, and she genuinely believed that they were building it together. She grieved that. Not the man Daniel had become, but the marriage she'd thought she was. In the partnership, she'd imagined the version of her life that had turned out to be something she'd been telling herself while a different story ran underneath. One of those nights, unable to sleep, she found herself thinking about the dance, about Ethan crossing the ballroom, about the way he'd said the Harborline concept using her private name for it, and how it had felt like being recognized after 11 years of standing in a room full of people who looked right through her. Her phone was on the nightstand. Ethan had sent his number to Rachel the week before with a message that Rachel had passed along. It had said only, "If she wants to talk at any hour about anything, I'm here. No pressure, no expectation, just here." She had not used it. She had told herself it was inappropriate that she was still married, that she needed to keep her focus. All true. But that night at 2 a.m, she picked up the phone, and she did not call, but she typed one line. "Why did you cross the room?" She stared at it. She almost deleted it. Then she sent it because she was done not saying the true thing. The reply came 4 minutes later. He was awake too, because I'd spent 2 years wondering why brilliant work had the wrong name on it. And then I walked into a room and saw the person who did the work sitting at the back of it being asked to disappear. And I decided I wasn't going to be one more person in that room who let it happen. She read it 3 times. She typed, "Most people would have shaken his hand." He wrote back, "I'm not most people. And neither, if you don't mind my saying so, are you. You built Harborline at a kitchen table at night. I've built things too. I know what that costs. I know what it means to make something real and watch someone else take the credit for it. Because it happened to me once a long time ago, and it's the reason I built my own company instead of staying at someone else's. So when I say I saw you, I mean it literally. I recognized what you were. It takes one to know one." Victoria sat in the dark hotel room with the phone glowing in her hand and felt for the first time in a very long time that she was talking to someone who was standing beside her rather than in front of her. She typed, "I don't know how this ends yet. Any of it." He wrote, "You don't have to. You just have to keep deciding things for yourself. One at a time. You've already started. The hardest one is behind you." She set the phone down. She slept that night better than she had in weeks. But the days that followed were not soft, and Daniel was not finished. He was, in fact, just getting dangerous. He knew now. He knew what she had. He knew about Frank and the financials and the Blakewood account. And a man like Daniel, cornered, does not fold. He fights the only way he knows how, which is to try to reshape the truth faster than it can be proven. I went to the board first. He got there ahead of the full picture, and he told them a story. He told them that Victoria was unstable, that the divorce had made her vindictive, that she was fabricating a claim to work that was rightfully the firm's, that she'd always been jealous of his success. He told them that Ethan Walker was behind all of it, that this was a hostile play by a rival, that Victoria was being used, that Walker had seduced her into torching her own husband's company so he could pick up the pieces. He was good at it. He'd always been good at it. He'd built an entire career out of being good at it. And for about a week, it worked. The board wavered. Some of them had known Daniel for 15 years. Some of them wanted to believe him because the alternative meant admitting they'd celebrated the wrong man for a decade. Victoria heard about it from Priya, who heard about it in the design department, And it landed on her harder than she expected, because it was one thing to know the truth and another to watch a man use his gift for lying to make the truth wobble. She called Rachel, and for the first time her voice was not steady. "He's turning it around. He's making me the villain. He's making Ethan the villain. He's telling them I'm crazy and jealous and being manipulated, and Rachel, they're listening to him because he's always been the one they listen to." Rachel let her get it all out. Then she said quietly, "Victoria, what's the one thing Daniel has never been able to argue with?" Victoria stopped. "What do you mean?" "His whole career," Rachel said. "His whole life. It's built on charm, on telling a better story, on making people feel a certain way, and it's worked because no one ever put the actual evidence on a screen in front of him in a room he couldn't talk his way out of." She paused. "So we're going to put the evidence on a screen, in front of the board, in a room he can't talk his way out of. We're going to give him exactly the arena he's spent his whole life avoiding. Not a story against a story against a file with a date on it." Victoria felt the steadiness come back into her cold and clean. "You want to do it at a board meeting," she said. "An emergency one, all of them in the room, Daniel too." "I want to do it," Rachel said, "in the one place where his charm has never had to face the receipts. And I want you there, Victoria, not me presenting, you. Because the most powerful thing in that room is not going to be the files. It's going to be the sight of the woman he tried to erase standing up whole and telling the truth with her own name attached to every word of it." Victoria closed her eyes. She thought of the small table by the kitchen. She thought of the card that had read Mrs. Daniel Hayes in a chair that wasn't hers. She thought of 11 years of standing behind a man while he accepted awards for her work. "Set it up," she said. "I'll be there." She hung up, and she sat for a moment, and then she picked up the phone again and sent one more message to Ethan, 3 words that were the truest thing she'd said in a decade: "I'm not disappearing." His reply came almost at once, "I never thought you would." And somewhere across the city, Daniel Hayes was rehearsing his version of events in the mirror, polishing the story that had carried him his whole life, unaware that the woman he had moved to the back of a ballroom was about to walk into a room full of the only people whose opinion he had left and hand them the one thing he had never once in all his years of charming and taking and erasing learned how to fight. The truth with a date on it, and her name on top. The emergency board meeting was set for a Thursday morning at 10, and Daniel Hayes walked in at 9:45, looking like a man who had already won. Victoria watched him from across the room and understood exactly what she was seeing because she had spent 11 years watching him do this. He worked the room before anyone sat down. He gripped shoulders. He remembered a board member's daughter's name asked about the graduation. He laughed at something the oldest director said, laughed a beat too long, warm and easy, making the man feel like the wittiest person alive. He was doing what he had always done, building the mood in the room before a single fact could be spoken, because Daniel had learned a long time ago that people don't decide with their minds first. They decide with their feelings, and then they find the facts to match. And he was very, very good at controlling how a room felt. He had not expected Victoria to be there. She saw the exact moment he registered her. He was mid-handshake, and his eyes swept the room the way they always did, cataloging his audience, and they landed on her sitting quietly at the far end of the long table, with a laptop closed in front of her, and Rachel Morgan at her side. And for just a second, one single second, the smile flickered. Then it came back wider than before. "Vic," he said, crossing to her arms, slightly open the picture of a wounded but gracious husband. "I didn't expect you. I'm glad you came. I really am. Whatever's happened between us, I've always said you deserve a voice." He said it loudly enough for the room. He was already performing, already building the story where he was the bigger person, and she was the one who needed his generosity. Victoria looked up at him. She did not stand. "Sit down, Daniel," she said quietly. "You're going to want to be sitting down." Something in the way she said it made him pause, but he covered it. He laughed lightly, spread his hands to the room as if to say, "You see what I'm dealing with," and took his seat at the head of the table. The seat he'd always taken, the seat that said whose room this was. The chairman, a silver-haired man named Warren Doyle, who had put the first real money into the firm a decade ago, called the meeting to order. He looked tired. He looked like a man who did not want to be there, who had heard things in the past 2 weeks he wished he hadn't, and who was hoping against everything that there was an explanation that would let the last 10 years stay the way he remembered them. "I'm going to be direct," Warren said. There are serious allegations, some of them made by Daniel about Victoria, some of them made by Victoria about Daniel, and frankly, some of them made by other people about this entire firm. He looked between them. Daniel, you asked for the chance to address the board. So did Victoria's counsel. We're going to hear both. Daniel, you first. Daniel stood. And he was magnificent. Victoria would give him that even then, even hating him. He was magnificent the way a con man is magnificent, the way a thing built entirely of surface can shine. He spoke without notes. He spoke about the 11 years he and Victoria had built the firm together, his voice catching at just the right moment. He spoke about the strain of success, about how it can pull two people apart, about how he took responsibility for his part in the failure of the marriage. I was disarming them. He was getting ahead of the affair by half confessing to it, framing it as a symptom of a marriage under pressure rather than a betrayal. And then slowly, carefully, he turned the knife. But I have to be honest with this board, he said, lowering his voice into gravity, because you deserve honesty even when it's painful. The divorce has not brought out the best in Victoria. She's hurting. I understand that. I caused some of that. But hurt people do things they later regret. And Victoria has begun making claims. Claims that she alone designed our most important projects. Claims that I stole her work. He shook his head sadly. I wish it were that simple. The truth is that everything this firm produces is a collaboration. It always has been. And I think in her pain, Victoria has convinced herself that the parts she touched were the whole. It's a comforting story to tell yourself when a marriage ends. It says, I was the one who mattered all along. Victoria felt the room shift. She felt it the way you feel weather change. A few of the directors were nodding slightly, the small, involuntary nods of people being gently guided toward a conclusion they'd like to reach. And I have to tell you one more thing. Daniel went on, and here his voice hardened. Here he played his highest card, because I'd be failing in my duty if I didn't. None of this started until Victoria was seen publicly at the Lakefront Gala in the arms of Ethan Walker, our chief competitor, a man who has tried to acquire pieces of this firm for years and failed. I don't want to say more than I can prove, but I would ask this board to consider very carefully whether these accusations are truly coming from my wife or whether they're coming through her from a rival who has finally found a way inside. He sat down. That's all. Thank you for listening. It was a masterpiece. Victoria had to sit with the horror of admitting that. In 4 minutes he had confessed to just enough to seem honest, reframed her authorship as delusion, and turned Ethan into a puppet master pulling her strings. Half the room was looking at her now, not with suspicion exactly, but with a soft, pitying doubt. Poor Victoria. Hurt, confused, maybe manipulated. It was the most dangerous version of the story he could have told, because it didn't paint her as a liar. It painted her as a victim of her own emotions, of Ethan Walker, of everything except the truth. Warren Doyle turned to her. Victoria, you've heard the response. Do you or your counsel wish to speak? Rachel started to rise. Victoria put a hand on her arm gently and stood up herself. I'll speak, she said. She did not have notes either. She had thought about having notes. Rachel had prepared a whole presentation, but standing there looking at the room full of men who had spent a decade shaking her husband's hand and never once learning what she did, she set all of it aside. Daniel is right about one thing, she said. Her voice was calm, and it carried, and the room quieted to hear it, because a calm voice in a tense room is louder than any shout. He is right that hurt people tell themselves stories. He's right that when a marriage ends, it's tempting to rewrite the past so that you come out looking better than you were. She paused. The difference between us is that I don't need to tell myself a story, because I kept the files. She opened the laptop. Daniel has always believed that the truth is whatever you can make people feel, she said, connecting it to the screen at the front of the room. He's very good at making people feel things. You've all just watched him do it. In 4 minutes, he made half of you feel sorry for me. That's a real skill. I used to admire it. The screen came to life. But there's one thing feelings can't do. They can't change the date a file was created. So I'm not going to tell you a story this morning. I'm going to show you some dates. The first image appeared on the screen. This is the original concept document for the project Daniel presented at the gala as his life's work, she said. The waterfront development, what I called when I designed it Harbor Line. Look at the corner of the screen. That's the creation date. That's the author field. She let them read it. That date is 22 months ago. That author field says Victoria Prescott Hayes. Not the firm, not Daniel, me. 22 months ago at my kitchen table at night. She clicked. This is the version Daniel submitted to investors 7 months ago. The two documents appeared side by side. Same renderings, same environmental restoration plan, same community housing framework down to the unit counts. The only difference between these two documents, the only meaningful difference in 700 pages is the cover page. Mine says my name. His says his. Everything in between is identical because it's the same work. He didn't collaborate on it. He didn't build on it. He renamed the file. The room had gone very still. The soft, pitying doubt was draining out of it. Warren Doyle had leaned forward. Daniel started to rise. This is exactly what I'm not finished, Victoria said, and she did not raise her voice, and Daniel, to his own visible surprise, sat back down. Something in the room had changed hands. He could feel it, and so could everyone else. Now Daniel will tell you these dates can be faked, she went on. He'll tell you I manufactured this, and that's a fair thing to wonder. So I want to introduce you to some people who don't work for me and don't work for Ethan Walker and have no reason to lie for either of us. She clicked again, and a new document filled the screen. This is a signed statement from Priya Desai, senior designer, who has worked at this firm for 6 years. She states that she received early drafts of Harborline from me directly over 18 months ago, and that at the time, Daniel had never mentioned the project to the design team. She has attached her own dated copies. Her name is on this statement. She knew when she signed it that she'd have to face Daniel in this building tomorrow. She signed it anyway. Click. Statement from Marcus Webb, project architect, same account. Click. Statement from 2 more members of the design department. She looked around the table. These aren't files, gentlemen. These are people. People who work in this building, who watched a woman do the work and a man take the bows, and who have carried that quietly for years because they were afraid of what would happen to their jobs if they said anything. They're not afraid anymore. Do you know why? She let the question sit. Because they watched him move my seat at a gala in front of 400 people, and something about seeing it done that openly, that shamelessly made them decide they were done, pretending they hadn't seen it all along. Warren Doyle spoke, and his voice was rough. Victoria, the financial matters. There have been questions raised about certain payments. Are you prepared to address those? And this was the moment Daniel had been dreading. Victoria saw it in him. Because the intellectual property, the stolen credit that could theoretically survive, that could be spun as a marital dispute, an ambiguity, a case of who said what. But the money could not be spun. The money was a crime. I am, Victoria said. But I'd rather they came from someone the board trusts more than they trust me right now. Someone who's worked here since the beginning and has no stake in my divorce. She turned toward the door. Frank. The door opened, and Frank Delgado walked in. Daniel went white. Frank was the firm's senior accountant. He was 63 years old. He wore the same brown suit he'd worn to every important meeting for 2 decades. And he was, by universal agreement, the most boring and most honest man in the building. When Frank Delgado spoke about numbers, people believed him, because Frank had never in his life said an interesting thing that wasn't also true. Frank sat down. He opened a folder, and in a flat, unhurried voice with no drama and no emotion, he destroyed Daniel Hayes. 8 months ago, Frank said, the firm began paying a vendor called Blakewood Strategic, monthly retainer, escalating, to date just under $400,000. He turned a page. I asked at the time what services Blakewood provided. I was told by Daniel to leave it alone, that it was a client relationship matter above my department. I did not leave it alone because leaving things alone is not what the board pays me to do. A murmur went around the table. I traced Blakewood Strategic. It was incorporated 9 months ago. It has 1 bank account. It has no employees. It has no offices. It has produced no deliverables that appear anywhere in our project records. It is, as far as I can determine, a company that exists only to receive money. He looked up over his glasses directly at Daniel, and its sole beneficial owner is Madison Blake. The room did not gasp. It was worse than a gasp. It went completely silent, the silence of grown men who had just watched their own naivety laid bare, who were doing the math, who were realizing that the charming man they'd celebrated for a decade had been robbing them to keep his girlfriend, and had counted on their fondness for him to keep them from ever looking. Warren Doyle put his hand over his mouth. Daniel stood up. He had to. There was nothing left to do but fight. This is a coordinated attack, he said, and his voice had lost its music, had gone tight and fast and defensive, the voice underneath the voice. Do you not see what's happening here? My wife, my competitor, my own disgruntled employees, all of them, all at once. The moment I'm about to close the biggest deal in this firm's history. You think that's a coincidence? Blakewood was Madison's idea. She set it up. She came to me with it. If there's fraud here, it's hers, not mine. I trusted the wrong person. That's my crime, trusting people. Daniel, Victoria said his name quietly, and it cut through his rising voice like a blade through cloth. Stop. He stopped. You're going to blame Madison, she said. I knew you would. You blame everyone. You blamed me for being jealous. You blamed Ethan for manipulating me. You blamed your employees for being disgruntled. And now you're going to blame a 26-year-old woman for a fraud scheme you designed, because that's what you do. When something you built collapses, you find the nearest person and you bury them under it. She reached into her bag. But here's the thing about blaming Madison, Daniel. You have to hope Madison stays quiet, and Madison isn't quiet anymore. She placed a single sheet of paper on the table and slid it toward Warren Doyle. That's a sworn statement from Madison Blake, she said, taken by her own attorney 3 days ago. In it, she states that Daniel Hayes personally instructed her to sign the incorporation documents for Blakewood Strategic, that he told her it was a legitimate bonus structure, that he set up the account, that she never provided any consulting services because there were never any consulting services to provide. She's attached text messages, gentlemen, from Daniel, discussing the payments, in his own words. Daniel lunged for the paper. Warren Doyle pulled it back. She turned on me, Daniel said, and it came out ragged, disbelieving a man watching the last floor drop out from under him. She turned on me, after everything. She turned on you, Victoria said, for the same reason your designers turned on you, and the same reason I turned on you. Because she finally understood what you'd done. You told her she was your future. You told me my place was behind you. You told this board you were a genius, and every one of those was the same lie, Daniel. The lie that other people exist to make you look bigger. Victoria's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it now, something that had been 11 years in the building. You didn't just replace my seat at that gala. You replaced my name on my work, and you replaced me in your bed, and you replaced the truth with a story every single day for a decade, and it worked. It all worked because everyone in this room wanted to believe you, including me, especially me. She looked around the table at the stunned faces at Warren Doyle, holding Madison's statement in a hand that had begun very slightly to shake. I'm not asking you to punish him, she said. That's not up to me anymore, and honestly, it's not even what I came here for. There are lawyers for that now, and probably people with badges before long. I came here for one reason. She reached over and closed the laptop, and the screen at the front of the room went dark, and it felt like a period at the end of a very long sentence. I came here so that every person who spent 10 years shaking his hand would finally know whose hand they should have been shaking. That's all. My name is Victoria Prescott. I designed Harborline. I designed most of what you've celebrated in this room for a decade, and I am not and never was standing behind him. I was holding him up. She sat down. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Warren Doyle set down Madison's statement, and he took off his glasses, and he rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand. And when he put the glasses back on, he looked 10 years older and somehow more honest than he had at the start. I want to say something, Warren said slowly, and I want it in the minutes. He looked at Daniel. Daniel, I have known you for 11 years. I put the first $2 million into this firm on the strength of a presentation you gave in my office. And I have to live now with the knowledge that I never once asked whether the person who gave the presentation was the same person who did the work. He shook his head. That's my failure. I let charm do my thinking for me. A lot of us in this room did. And it's cost us, and it's about to cost us a great deal more, because I don't see how this firm survives what's about to become public without significant change. He turned to the board. I move that Daniel Hayes be removed effective immediately as Chief Executive Officer and from all positions with this company, pending the outcome of the investigation that we are, I think all of us understand now, legally obligated to open. Do I have a second? Second, said a woman 3 seats down without hesitation. Discussion? There was none. 11 years of relationships, and there was no discussion because the files did not have relationships, and neither did the dates, and neither did Frank Delgado's flat, honest voice. All in favor. The eyes went around the table, one after another, and each one landed on Daniel like a separate blow, and Victoria made herself watch, not with triumph, but because she had earned the right to watch, and because she was never going to look away from a hard truth again, as long as she lived. Daniel did not vote. Daniel sat in the chair at the head of the table that had always been his in the room, that had always been his, and watched it stop being his in real time, and the expression on his face was one Victoria had seen only twice before. Once at the gala when Ethan crossed the room, and once in their bedroom when she told him she kept the receipts. It was fear, but it had changed. It wasn't the fear of losing control anymore. Control was gone. This was the deeper fear underneath it, the one he'd been running from his whole life, the one his entire performance had been built to keep hidden, even from himself. It was the fear of being seen, fully, as he actually was, not the genius, not the face of the firm, just a man who had never built a single thing that was truly his, who had spent his whole life standing on other people and calling their height his own, and who was now standing on nothing at all in front of everyone with the truth on a dark screen behind him and his name being struck from the record. "The motion carries," Warren Doyle said quietly. "Daniel, I'm going to ask you to leave the building. Security will see you out. You'll be hearing from the firm's counsel, and I suspect from others." Daniel stood. He looked at the board. He looked at Frank, who looked back at him without a flicker. He looked at Rachel, who did not bother to look up from her notes. And then he looked at Victoria, and for a moment the old thing came into his face, the charm, the reach, the last desperate attempt to find the words that had always worked before. "Vic," he said, "you don't have to do this. Whatever they've decided in here, you and I, we can still, there's a version of this where we—" "There isn't, Daniel," she said, not cruelly, almost gently, which was worse. "There was never a version where you saw me. You only ever saw what I could hold up. And a person can survive not being loved. But nobody should have to spend their life being useful to someone who's decided you're furniture." She met his eyes one last time. "Go. And when the lawyers ask you what happened, tell them the truth for once. Tell them you moved a woman's seat at a gala, and it turned out she'd been quietly keeping every receipt for 11 years, and she finally decided to add them up." 2 security guards had appeared at the door. Daniel looked at them, and something in him finally understood that there was no story left to tell, no room left to charm, no seat left to take. He walked toward the door. At the threshold he stopped, and Victoria thought he might turn around, might say one more thing. He didn't. He just stood there for a second with his back to the room he had ruled for a decade, and then he walked out of it, and the door closed behind him, and he was gone. The room let out a long breath all at once. Warren Doyle turned to Victoria, and the old man, the one who had put in the first $2 million, the one who had let charm do his thinking, looked at her with something she had not expected and did not quite know what to do with. Respect, plain and unmistakable. "Ms. Prescott," he said, using the name she'd reclaimed, saying it carefully, as if to make up for 11 years of it going unspoken. "I think this board owes you a conversation, a serious one, about the firm, about Harbor Line, about what happens next, and what your place in it ought to be." He paused. "If you're willing to have it." Victoria looked at him. She looked at the dark screen. She looked at the empty chair at the head of the table where Daniel had sat for a decade, and she thought about the small table by the kitchen where a card had once sent her, and she understood that the distance between those 2 seats was the whole story of her life, and that she had just finally closed it. "I'm willing," she said, "but not today. Today I think I'd like to go home." She almost laughed at the word, because she didn't have one yet. Not really just a hotel room and a maiden name and a future she hadn't drawn yet. "Or wherever home is going to be. We'll talk next week. All of us. And when we do, I'll come with a plan. I always have a plan. That was never the thing I was missing." She gathered her laptop and her bag, and she stood, and Rachel stood with her, and as they walked toward the door, Frank Delgado, the most boring and honest man in the building, said something he had clearly been holding in his flat and careful chest for a very long time. "For what it's worth, Miss Prescott," Frank said, "some of us always knew, and it's a good day. It's the first good day this place has had in a long time." Victoria stopped. She looked at him, this quiet man in his brown suit, who had refused to leave the numbers alone, who had kept his own records for 2 decades, who had understood long before she did that. The truth doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be kept. "Thank you, Frank," she said, and she meant it more than almost anything she'd said all morning. Then she walked out of the room past the empty chair into the hallway, where an hour earlier a man had gripped shoulders and remembered daughters' names and built the feeling of a room he no longer had any right to stand in. And she felt the strangest thing settle over her as the elevator doors opened and she stepped inside. Not victory, not yet. Victory was a word for later. What she felt riding down alone with her name finally on her own work was quiet, a deep, clean quiet she had not felt in 11 years. The quiet of a person who has stopped at long last, holding someone else up and discovered that her own 2 feet had been perfectly capable of carrying her the entire time. The quiet did not last because the world does not let a story like this stay quiet, and within 3 days, it was everywhere. The removal of Daniel Hayes could not be kept inside a boardroom. Too many people knew, too much money was involved. And when a firm as visible as Hayes Development opens an internal investigation and marches its founder out of the building with security, the phone calls start and the reporters follow the phone calls, and by the end of the week the story had a headline, and the headline had Victoria's name in it, though not the way she would have chosen. The first article framed it as a scandal, all affair and betrayal, the mistress and the necklace and the gala, because that was the version that sold. Victoria read it in her hotel room and felt sick because it made her a supporting character in her own catastrophe, again the wronged wife the woman it happened to. There was one line about her being the alleged designer of the firm's projects buried in the 11th paragraph, hedged and doubtful. She put the phone down and called Rachel. "They've made me the wife again," she said. 11 years of work, and I'm a paragraph, an alleged paragraph. Rachel was quiet for a second. Then she said, "So change it." "How?" "You have every file. You have the sworn statements. You have Frank. You have the truth, Victoria, and right now there's a reporter out there who wrote a lazy story because the truth hadn't been handed to her yet." Rachel's voice sharpened. "You spent 11 years letting a man be the face of your work. You're free of him now. So stop waiting for someone else to tell your story and tell it yourself, for once, out loud, with your name on it." Victoria sat with that. It was she realized the exact thing she had spent her whole marriage unable to do, not the work. She'd never been afraid of the work. She'd been afraid of the credit. Afraid to stand up and say I did this because Daniel had trained her patiently over a decade to believe that claiming her own work was somehow arrogant, somehow disloyal, somehow not her place. "All right," she said, "set up the interview, but not the scandal reporter. Find me someone who writes about the actual work, the development, the design. I'm not going to talk about the affair. I'm going to talk about Harbor Line." The interview ran 10 days later in the business section, not the gossip pages, and it changed everything. Because when Victoria sat down with a reporter who actually understood development and walked him through the environmental restoration plan, the community housing framework, the reasons behind every decision, the reporter did something the scandal writer never could. He understood that she knew it cold. He understood within 20 minutes that no person could speak about a project that way unless they had built it from nothing, and he wrote that, and the story that ran was not about a wronged wife. It was about the architect the city had never known it had. The headline read simply, "The Woman Behind Harbor Line," and underneath it was a photograph of Victoria, not dressed up, not on a stage, just standing in front of a rendering of the waterfront with her arms crossed and her chin up, looking exactly like a person who had made the thing behind her. The response was not what she expected. It was bigger. By the end of that week, her inbox was full, not just from people at the firm, from strangers, from women, mostly women who wrote to say they had read her story and recognized their own. Women who had done the work while someone else took the podium. Women who had been moved to the back of their own lives so quietly they hadn't noticed until they read about someone else's gala and felt something crack open. One message from a woman in Cleveland Victoria had never met said only, "I've been holding him up for 14 years. I didn't have a word for it until I read what he did to you. Thank you for the word." Victoria read that one 4 times, and then she sat down and cried. Finally, the tears she'd been refusing since the night at the gala, but they were not the tears she'd expected. They weren't grief. They were something closer to release the crying you do when you've been carrying a weight so long you forgot it was heavy, and someone finally lifts it, and your body doesn't know what to do with the lightness. Meanwhile, Daniel was drowning, and he was doing it exactly the way she had predicted. The investigation had gone federal, as Rachel had warned it would, the moment the Blakewood documents crossed the right desk. And Daniel, cornered fighting for his life, did the only thing he'd ever known how to do. He tried to find someone to bury under the wreckage. First, he tried to bury Madison. His lawyers filed a response painting her as the mastermind, a scheming young woman who had seduced a vulnerable executive and manipulated him into a fraud scheme for her own enrichment. It might even have worked once, but Madison had done exactly what Victoria told her to do. She had gone to a lawyer early. She had turned over every text, every email, every instruction Daniel had ever given her in writing. And in Daniel's own words, time-stamped and undeniable, were the sentences that ended his defense. Set up the LLC, we'll route it through there. Don't overthink it, everybody does this. Just sign where I told you. A jury would not need much explaining. When burying Madison failed, Daniel turned as Victoria had known he eventually would to burying her. He called her. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Victoria. His voice was different now, stripped. The charm was gone, worn all the way down to the desperate thing underneath. I need you to call them off. The board, your lawyer. This has gone too far. They're talking about prison Vic. Actual prison. You don't want that. You couldn't want that. Whatever I did, whatever you think I did, that's not. We were married for 11 years. You don't send someone you love to prison. Victoria stood at the window of her hotel room with the phone against her ear, and she felt the old pull one final time. The pull to soften, to fix, to take responsibility for his feelings. She let it come. She had learned not to fear it, and she let it go. I'm not sending you anywhere, Daniel, she said. I didn't build Blakewood. I didn't move company money to a fake company for 8 months. I didn't sign anything or tell anyone to sign anything. You did all of that alone in the dark while I was still ironing your shirts. She paused. The lawyers aren't coming for you because of me. They're coming for you because of you. I just stopped standing in front of it. You're enjoying this. His voice turned ugly the way it always eventually did when charm failed. You're loving every minute. The interview, the photo. Poor Victoria, the misunderstood genius. You think you've won something. You think Ethan Walker actually wants you, or does he just want the pieces of my firm and you came attached to them? You're going to find out, Vic. You're going to find out that the only reason anyone's paying attention to you is because of what I built. And once that fades, you're going to be exactly what you always were. The help. Victoria closed her eyes, and she waited to feel it, the old wound, the one he was aiming for, the one that had kept her small for 11 years. The fear that he was right, that she was only the help, that her worth was borrowed from his. She waited, and it didn't come. That was the moment she understood she was actually free. Not free in the legal sense, not free on paper. Free in the only place that had ever really held her captive, which was inside her own head, where for 11 years she had let Daniel's voice be the voice that told her what she was worth. Goodbye, Daniel, she said. And she hung up, and she did not call back, and he called 9 more times that night, and she did not answer a single one, and each unanswered call felt less like cruelty and more like a door quietly closing room by room on a house. She was finally ready to leave. The divorce, when it settled, was not close. With the fraud investigation active and the intellectual property claim documented beyond dispute, Daniel had no leverage left. Rachel secured Victoria's grandmother's trust in full, every dollar of the $2 million he had tried to reach. She secured Victoria's ownership stake in the firm, the stake Daniel had tried to erase. And she secured in a clause Victoria insisted on personally the formal legal acknowledgement that Victoria Prescott was the sole author of the Harborline concept and its associated intellectual property. That last clause was worth less than the money on paper. It was worth everything to Victoria, because it was her name in a legal document, permanent, unerasable, saying the true thing at last. She read it the day it was signed alone, and she ran her finger under her own name, the way you might touch something you'd thought was lost and found again. But the real turn, the one that surprised even Rachel, came from the board. They asked Victoria to come back, not as a designer, not behind anyone. They asked her to take a leadership role in the firm she had built and been erased from, to help steer it through the wreckage, to be, in the words Warren Doyle used when he called her, the person this company should have been listening to for a decade. Victoria did not say yes right away. She thought about it for a week. She thought about walking those halls again, sitting in that boardroom, the ghost of Daniel in every corner. She thought about whether returning was strength or whether it was going backward. And in the middle of that week, Ethan Walker made her an offer of his own. They had kept talking through all of it. Nothing hurried. He had never once pressed, never once tried to make her feel like she owed him for the dance, never positioned himself as the rescuer at the end of the story. He'd simply been there at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, a steady voice on the other end of the phone that asked good questions and disagreed with her when he thought she was wrong, which she found to her own surprise she liked more than any amount of agreement. His offer was this: Walker Global would partner on the waterfront development, not acquire it, partner. Victoria would lead the design and the vision with full authorship and full control. Walker Global would bring the capital and the scale. And he said carefully that arrangement stood entirely on its own, whatever she decided about anything else between them, because he did not want her to ever wonder, not for 1 second, whether the professional respect was a lever for the personal interest. "I need you to hear the difference," he said to her on the phone the night he made the offer. "Daniel wanted a wife who made him look powerful. I'm offering you a partnership where you're already powerful, and I get to build alongside it. Those aren't the same thing. I need you to know I know they aren't the same thing." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "Why does it matter so much to you," she asked, "that I know the difference?" "Because," Ethan said, "I watched a man spend a decade convincing a brilliant woman she was furniture, and I decided that if I ever got the chance to stand next to her, I was going to spend my time reminding her she was the architect. That's all I want, Victoria. Not to hold you up, not to be held up, just to stand next to something real and help it get built." He paused. "You can say no. To the partnership, to dinner, to all of it. And I'll still think the interview you gave was the best thing this city's read in years, and I'll still tell anyone who asks that Harborline is the smartest development plan of the decade, because it's true, and it was true before I ever wanted to have dinner with you." Victoria took the partnership, and she took the leadership role at the firm too in the end, but on her own terms. She wrote herself terms that would have been unthinkable to the woman who sat at the small table by the kitchen. She would return, but the firm would be restructured. The old culture, the culture of one charming face, taking credit for a building full of quiet work, was over. She insisted on it in writing. Every project would name its actual authors. Every designer would be seen. She was not going to preside over the same machine that had erased her. She was going to break it and build a better one. Warren Doyle, when she laid it out, looked at her across the same table where Daniel had once ruled, and he said, "You know, in 11 years, no one ever proposed anything like this. Everyone was too busy managing him." "That was the problem," Victoria said. "You built a whole company around managing one man's ego. Imagine what you could have built if you'd spent that energy on the work instead." She slid the restructuring proposal across the table. "So let's find out." He signed it. She reworked Harborline itself, too, and this was the change that meant the most to her, though it made the accountants nervous at first. Daniel's version had always had a quiet rot in it, a compromise he'd made to please investors, a plan that would have displaced the very working families who already lived along that stretch of the lakefront to make room for luxury towers. Victoria had fought him on it for years and lost because it wasn't her name on the plan, and so it wasn't her decision. Now it was. She rebuilt it. She folded affordable housing into the core of the development, not as an afterthought or a tax gesture, but as the spine of the whole thing. She protected the small businesses that had lived in that neighborhood for generations. She wrote the community into the plan instead of writing them out of it the way she had always wanted to, the way she had originally designed it before Daniel had made her strip the unprofitable parts away. An investor pushed back hard in a meeting. He told her the affordable housing would cost them millions in potential luxury revenue. He told her she was letting emotion cloud her judgment. He told her, and Victoria heard the ghost of Daniel in every word of it, that she should stick to design and let the businessmen handle the money. Victoria let him finish. Then she stood up, walked to the screen, and spent the next 20 minutes showing him in numbers why he was wrong. The community integration wasn't charity. It was the reason the project would have city support tax incentives, faster permitting, and a tenant base that wasn't dependent on a volatile luxury market. She had run every number. She always ran every number. And by the end of it, the investor who had told her to stick to design was nodding, and the room understood something it had never understood under Daniel. That the woman at the front of the room was the smartest person in it, and always had been, and the only thing that had changed was that she was finally allowed to stand there. Ethan was in that meeting. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just watched her dismantle the man's argument piece by piece, and afterward in the hallway he said one thing: You didn't need me in there at all." "No," Victoria said, "I didn't." "Good," he said, and he smiled, and she understood that he meant it, that her not needing him was to this man, the whole point, the opposite of everything Daniel had wanted, and she felt something settle in her chest that she had not felt in 11 years and had almost stopped believing was real. Months passed. The investigation ground forward. Daniel's world contracted, and Madison's, though hers, was smaller and softer, since she had cooperated and told the truth, and had been young and used, and the law in the end treated the architect of the fraud differently from the frightened woman who had signed where she was told. Victoria followed it all at a distance. She did not gloat. She had promised herself that first night in her office that she would not become someone whose happiness depended on watching another person fall, and she kept that promise the way she kept all her promises to herself, now carefully, deliberately, because they were the only promises that had never once been broken. She thought about Daniel less and less, not out of forgiveness exactly, but out of something better, indifference. He had occupied the center of her life for 11 years, and now he occupied a shrinking corner of it, and one day she realized she had gone a full week without a single thought of him, and she noticed it, the way you notice a headache is gone, with a kind of quiet disbelief that you ever lived with it at all. And then one evening, Ethan asked her to dinner. Not a meeting, not a partnership discussion, not investors or renderings or the firm, just dinner. He said it plainly the way he said everything. "I've spent months making sure you knew the work and the respect had nothing to do with wanting to have dinner with you. I think I've made the point. So now I'd like to ask you to dinner, and I'd like you to know that this one is just dinner, and you can say no, and Monday we'll still be partners, and nothing will be strange." Victoria stood in her office, the office that was hers now with her name on the door and her renderings on the wall, and she thought about the last time a man had extended his hand to her across a room and asked her a simple question about what she wanted. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." The dinner was quiet. There were no cameras, no deals, no one to perform for. They talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, about buildings and childhoods and the strange loneliness of being the person who does the work. And at some point, Victoria realized she was doing something she had not done in longer than she could remember. She was being entirely herself, not the supportive wife, not the woman behind the man, not even the wronged genius from the newspaper. Just Victoria saying what she actually thought and being met every time by someone who was interested in the answer. Near the end of the night, Ethan said, "Can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" "Of course." "When I crossed that ballroom at the gala, I didn't have a plan. Everyone thinks I did. Everyone thinks it was some brilliant strategic move against Daniel. It wasn't. I walked in and I saw you at that table by the kitchen, and I saw your name card gone, and I saw that necklace on the wrong woman, and something in me just moved. Before my head caught up, I've spent my whole life being calculated, Victoria, building things carefully. That was the least calculated thing I've done in 20 years. He looked at her. "I didn't cross that room to beat Daniel. I crossed it because I couldn't stand to be one more person who let you sit there." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. "You know what the strangest part is," she said quietly. "For 11 years I thought the worst thing that could happen to me was losing my seat. And then I lost it in front of 400 people in the most humiliating way I could imagine." She turned her wine glass slowly. "And it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me, because I'd spent 11 years defending a seat that was never really mine. It was next to him. It was borrowed. And the day he took it away, I had to go find my own." She smiled. "And my own turned out to be at the head of the table." Ethan raised his glass. "To finding your own seat." "To building it," Victoria said. "I didn't find it. I built it. There's a difference. Daniel found his by taking someone else's. I built mine from nothing at a kitchen table at night." She touched her glass to his. "I'm never going to forget the difference again." They drank to it. And later, when he walked her out, he did not presume anything. He did not reach for her. He simply said good night and thanked her for the evening and told her he'd see her Monday, and it was that restraint, that steady refusal to take anything she had not offered, that told her more about the man than any grand gesture ever could. She drove home alone to the new place. She'd found a place that was hers, chosen by her, paid for with her own reclaimed money and her own name on the lease. And for the first time since the night of the gala, she did not feel like a woman recovering from something. She felt like a woman beginning something. She thought as she drove about the woman in Cleveland who had written to thank her for the word. She thought about the hundreds of messages. She thought about all the people, women and men, who had held someone else up in the dark and been told it was their place. And she made a decision right there at a red light with her hands steady on the wheel, the same steadiness she'd felt the night everything ended. She was going to keep telling the story, not for revenge. Daniel wasn't worth revenge, and revenge, she'd learned, was just another way of letting someone stay at the center of your life. She was going to tell it because somewhere out there was another woman, at another small table by another kitchen, being asked to disappear, telling herself it was her place, explaining it away one more time. And maybe Victoria thought if that woman heard this story, she'd understand what took Victoria 11 years and a public humiliation to learn. That your worth was never something someone else assigned to you. That the seat they put you in was never a measure of what you were owed. That a person who truly valued you would never once ask you to become smaller so they could look larger. And that sometimes the day you lose the seat you've been clinging to is the very day you finally become free enough to build your own. The light turned green. Victoria drove home. A year after the night that ended everything, the invitation came, and Victoria almost laughed out loud when she saw where the celebration would be held. The same ballroom, the same hotel overlooking the lake, the same room where a card reading Mrs. Daniel Hayes had once sat in a chair that wasn't hers, where a waiter had once led her to a small table by the kitchen, where 400 people had watched her be moved to the back of her own life. That room. The firm wanted to hold the grand opening celebration for the new Harbor Line development there, and when the event coordinator asked Victoria if the venue was acceptable, she sat with the question for a long moment. Then she said, "It's perfect." Because there was something she needed to do in that room, and it had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with closing a circle she had been walking for a year. The development had opened 2 weeks earlier, and it was already, by every measure that mattered the most, talked about project in the city. Not because of the scandal. The scandal had faded the way scandals do, replaced by newer ones. It was talked about because of what it was. The affordable housing was full, families already moved in, children already in the local schools. The small businesses that Daniel's version would have bulldozed were still there, thriving now, folded into the ground floors of the new buildings. The environmental restoration along the waterfront had brought back birds no one had seen on that stretch of lake in 30 years. It was, everyone agreed, a model, a blueprint, the way development should be done. And every article about it, every single one, named its architect. Victoria Prescott, not alleged, not behind anyone, the architect. The night of the celebration, Victoria arrived early before the guests, and she walked into the empty ballroom alone. She stood for a while where the small table had been. It was gone now, of course, replaced by rows of chairs facing a stage. But she knew the spot. Her body knew it. She stood there and let herself remember the woman who had sat in that place a year ago, hands folded, being polite to a waiter, while her whole life quietly ended around her, and she felt a tenderness toward that woman she had not been able to feel at the time. Not pity, tenderness, because that woman sitting so still at the back of the room had already made her decision. She just hadn't known it yet. "You look like you're saying goodbye to someone," a voice said. Ethan had come in behind her. They were together now, had been for months, though they'd kept it quiet and unhurried and entirely their own, the way they'd built everything else. He never rushed. It was one of the 10,000 things she'd come to love about him. He didn't rush a room, didn't rush a deal, didn't rush her. "I am, in a way," Victoria said. "I'm saying goodbye to the woman who used to sit right here." Ethan came and stood beside her, and he looked at the spot too, though he couldn't see what she saw. "What would you tell her?" he asked. "If you could," Victoria thought about it. She'd thought about it in truth for a year. "I'd tell her that the worst night of her life was actually the first night of it," she said. "I'd tell her that the seat she was so afraid of losing was never hers to begin with, and losing it was the only thing that could have ever set her free." She turned to him. "And I'd tell her to stop being so polite to that waiter, to stand up, to flip the table over, to walk out the front door with her head up an hour before she actually did." She smiled. "But she got there. That's the thing. She got there in the end. She just took the long way." The guests began to arrive an hour later, and the room that had once been the scene of Victoria's humiliation filled with people who had come to celebrate her work. Warren Doyle was there, older, and Victoria thought kinder than he'd been a year ago, a man who had learned something late, but had learned it. Frank Delgado was there in the same brown suit, and Victoria made sure he was seated near the front, because the most honest man in the building deserved a good seat, and she was never again going to let anyone she valued sit at the back of a room. Priya was there, and Marcus and the whole design department, every one of them named now in the program as contributors to Harborline, every one of them visible, because Victoria had rebuilt the firm on a single principle, which was that the people who do the work get their names on the work always without exception, forever. Madison did not come. Victoria had, in a gesture that surprised even herself, sent her an invitation. Madison had written back a short, careful note declining, saying she didn't think she belonged there, but thanking Victoria for the thought, and adding one line at the end. "You didn't have to be kind to me. I'll spend a long time trying to understand why you were." Victoria had read it and set it aside and thought, that's her journey now, not mine. She had wished her well genuinely and closed that door softly the way you close a door on a room you're never going back into but hold no anger toward. And Daniel. Daniel was not there and would not have been welcome, and was at that moment in the middle of a legal process that would occupy the next several years of his life. The firm had survived his removal barely restructured and renamed and rebuilt around the truth instead of around him. He had lost the company, the reputation, the woman he'd left his wife for, and the woman he'd tried to erase, and he had lost them all in the same season, and he had lost them in the end, not because of any grand revenge, but because of dates on files and a signature he'd never bothered to add, and a wife who kept the receipts. Victoria had heard through a mutual acquaintance that he still told the story his own way, that in his version he was the victim of a conspiracy, a betrayal, a coordinated attack by his wife and his rival. She had heard it and felt nothing at all, and the nothing was its own kind of victory, the completion of a process that had started at that small table a year ago, when she'd first noticed that his voice no longer had the power to tell her what she was worth. The program began. There were speeches. Warren Doyle spoke, and he did something Victoria had not expected. He apologized. Publicly in front of everyone in the same room where Daniel had once been celebrated, the chairman of the board stood up and said that the firm had spent a decade honoring the wrong person, and that its greatest failure had not been the fraud, which was one man's crime, but the culture that had made the fraud possible, the culture that had let charm stand in for substance, and had never once thought to ask who actually did the work. He said Victoria's name. He said it clearly. He said the firm existed today because a woman it had overlooked for 11 years had been generous enough to come back and save it, and the room stood and applauded, and Victoria sat very still and let it wash over her, and thought about how strange it was that the thing she had wanted for 11 years, this exact recognition in this exact room, had finally come, and how it mattered, and also somehow mattered less than she'd once imagined, because she no longer needed it to know who she was. That was the real change. That was the thing a year had taught her. The applause was nice. The recognition was just. But she was no longer waiting for it, no longer dependent on it, no longer built out of other people's opinions of her. She'd built herself out of her own work, now her own choices, her own steady hands, and that foundation didn't crack when the applause stopped, because it had never been resting on the applause in the first place. Then it was her turn to speak. She walked to the stage in the room where she had once been sent to the back, and she stood at the podium and looked out at the faces, and she did not have notes, because she never had notes anymore, because she knew at last exactly what she thought, and was no longer afraid to say it out loud with her name attached. "A year ago," she began, "I sat at a small table at the back of this room. Some of you were here. You saw it." A quiet ripple went through the crowd. My name card had been moved. My seat had been given to someone else. And I sat there at that little table by the kitchen, and I want to tell you what I was thinking because I think it matters. She paused. I was thinking about how to make the evening go smoothly, for my husband. I was worried about his big night. I was sitting in the wreckage of my own marriage at the back of a room where I'd just been publicly erased, and my very first instinct was to make sure I didn't cause any trouble for the man who'd erased me. The room was silent. I tell you that not because I'm proud of it, Victoria went on, but because I think a lot of you know that feeling. The instinct to make yourself smaller, to keep the peace, to hold someone up even as they're pushing you down. I spent 11 years doing that, and I told myself the whole time that it was love, that it was partnership, that it was my place. Her voice was steady, and it carried to every corner. It wasn't any of those things. It was fear. Fear that I was only worth what I could do for someone else. Fear that if I stood up and said, "This is mine, I built this, I matter," the whole thing would come crashing down and I'd be left with nothing. She looked out over the room. "Well," she said, "it did come crashing down. Everything I was afraid of losing I lost in one night in this room in front of all of you. And I stand here a year later to tell you the truth that took me 11 years and one very public humiliation to learn." She let it land. "I didn't lose anything that night that was ever really mine. The seat wasn't mine. The name on the projects wasn't mine because I'd let someone take it. Even the marriage wasn't what I thought it was. The only thing that was ever truly mine was the work. And the work, it turns out, remembers who made it. You can take a name off a cover page. You cannot take the truth out of the thing itself." Somewhere in the crowd, a woman was crying. Victoria saw her. She did not know her. It didn't matter. She was speaking to her anyway. She was speaking to every version of the woman she used to be. "There's a question people keep asking me," Victoria said. "Reporters mostly. They ask it like it's the clever question, the one that gets to the real story. They ask whether the best part of all this, the sweetest revenge, was ending up with my ex-husband's greatest rival." A few people laughed softly. Ethan in the front row smiled and shook his head. "And every time they ask it, I know they've misunderstood the entire story, because they think this was a story about two men, the one who wronged me and the one who saved me. And it was never that. It was never about either of them." She gripped the edges of the podium. "Ethan didn't save me," she said clearly, so there could be no mistake. "I want to be very precise about that because it matters, and because there's a version of this story where he's the hero and I'm the prize, and that version is a lie. He didn't save me. He asked me to dance. That's all." He extended his hand, and for the first time in 11 years, someone asked me what I wanted instead of telling me, and I'm grateful to him for that more than I can say. But what I did after I took his hand, everything after the files, the board meeting, the interview, the firm, this building, this development, the families living in it right now tonight, all of that, I did that. Nobody rescued me. I walked out of this room a year ago and I rescued myself. The applause started, but she raised a hand gently because she wasn't finished, and there was one more thing, the thing she'd come into this room to say. "The night my husband gave my seat away," she said, and her voice dropped and the room leaned in to catch it. "He thought he was showing the world that I didn't matter, that I was replaceable, that my place was wherever he decided to put me. And for a year people have told me what a monster he was to do it." She shook her head slowly. "But I'm going to tell you something I've never said out loud. I'm grateful he did it. I mean that, because as long as I had that seat next to him, I was never going to leave it. I would have sat in that borrowed chair for the rest of my life, holding him up, disappearing, whenever his success required it, telling myself it was love. He didn't take my seat away from me. He set me free from it. He just didn't mean to." She looked out at all of them, at Warren and Frank and Priya, and the whole rebuilt firm, at Ethan in the front row, looking up at her with an expression that had nothing of ownership in it, and everything of respect, at the strangers and the families and the woman crying in the back. "So here's what I know now," Victoria said, "that I didn't know a year ago when I sat at that little table and worried about making a scene. Your worth is not determined by where someone else decides to place you. The seat they put you in is not a measure of what you're owed. And a person who truly loves you, a person who actually sees you, will never, not once, ask you to become smaller so that they can look bigger." She paused, and her voice was absolutely steady, the steadiest it had ever been. "I spent 11 years standing beside a man who never saw me. It took losing my seat to make me find my own. And the place I found, it turned out, wasn't beside anyone. It was at the head of my own table, in my own name, doing my own work. It was there the whole time. I just had to be pushed out of the borrowed chair to finally go claim it." The room rose, all of them at once on their feet. And the applause that filled the ballroom where she had once been humiliated was not polite applause, not the obligatory kind, but the real kind, the kind that comes up out of people because they've heard something true. And Victoria stood at the podium and received it, not because she needed it, but because she had earned it, and there is a difference, and she knew the difference now, and she would never forget it again. Later, after the speeches, after the crowd had thinned, and the celebration had softened into something quieter, Ethan found her near the tall windows looking out at the lake, at the development lit up along the waterfront, at the buildings she had drawn at a kitchen table at night, while a man who didn't see her slept in the next room. He didn't say anything for a while. He just stood beside her. That was his way. Then quietly he extended his hand. "Victoria," he said, "would you dance with me?" And it was the same words, the exact same words from the exact same room, but everything about them was different now. A year ago, when he'd said them, the whole room had been watching to see if she would be embarrassed, waiting to see her humiliated, and she'd taken his hand as an act of defiance, a way to survive a moment designed to destroy her. Now no one was watching. No one was waiting for her to fall. There was no rival to spite, no crowd to shock, no scene to survive. There was just a man she had chosen in a room she had reclaimed, asking her a simple question about what she wanted. Victoria looked at his hand, and then she looked at him. "You know what I realized," she said. "A year ago, when you asked me that, I said yes, because it was the only way to hold my head up in a room that wanted me broken. I said yes to survive." She smiled, and there was nothing broken in it anywhere. "This time I'm saying yes just because I want to. That's the whole reason. No survival, no defiance, no revenge. I just want to dance with you. That," Ethan said softly, "is the only reason worth saying yes to anything." She took his hand. And they danced, the two of them, in the room where a year ago her name had been struck from a chair, and this time her name was on the walls, on the program, on the buildings outside the window, on everything she had built, and everything she had reclaimed permanent now, unerasable hers. She danced not as someone's wife, not as someone's assistant, not as the woman behind the man, not as the prize at the end of another man's story. She danced as Victoria Prescott, architect, who had built the very ground they were celebrating on, who had walked out of this room a year ago with nothing but the truth and a folder of files, and had walked back in, owning all of it. She thought, as they turned slowly under the lights, about the woman at the small table by the kitchen. She thought about how sure that woman had been that losing her seat was the end of her. She wished she could reach back through the year and tell her the one thing she'd have refused to believe, that it wasn't the end. That the night she lost her seat was the night her real life began. That the seat had never been the point at all. The seat was never the point. The point was learning that she'd never needed anyone's permission to sit at the front of the room, because she'd built the room and she'd built the table and she'd built herself from nothing at a kitchen table at night with her own two steady hands. The point was discovering that her worth had never once lived in a chair someone else assigned her. It had lived the entire time in her waiting for the day she'd stop letting other people tell her where to sit. Daniel had spent 11 years trying to make her small enough to fit behind him. He had failed. He had failed completely and permanently, and the proof of his failure was lit up all along the waterfront outside that window, and printed on every program in that room, and standing at the head of a firm she now led, and dancing under the lights with a man who had crossed a ballroom once because he could not stand to watch her disappear. She had lost her seat. And in losing it, she had found something no one could ever take from her again, something Daniel had never understood and never would, something worth more than any chair at any table in any room in the world. She had found out exactly who she was, and she was never ever going to make herself smaller for anyone again.